in this episode.
Yeah, we're thinking beings, we're speaking beings, but we're also walking beings and feeling beings and muscle-bound skeletal beings.
Hmm.
And I remain convinced that our experience of thinking is it. How do you disconnect it from physicality? I just don't think you can. Or, well, you can, but it becomes this abstract thing. It's funny. I was talking to somebody earlier. It's to me, it's a disembodied concept. Like when somebody talks about, oh, the soul or something. Well, okay, but how do you locate the soul? It's a conception. You can't point to it, but you can.
Yeah, yeah.
And
But
and and maybe I'm too much of a physicalist in that regard, but
yeah,
I, I do think the body's way more important, and there's something about just wanting to circumvent flesh that just I think is the central. Maybe it's because it's the body ties you to death. And people are so desperate to circumvent it, whether it's through religion or through digitality.
yeah,
You know, like
I
live forever in a cloud.
yeah, yeah. I have a follow-up question on that. This is actually, you being a theologian especially, but also I've been thinking about the notion that there's something about the body when we are confronted with the body.
Yeah,
It's almost we can't fathom. I joke around that, we humans we have Galileo and Einstein and we listen to Chopin and beautiful
yeah,
art, but we also shit and piss and we're kind of our bodies are quite disgusting. So there's something where we can't fathom how both these things can. It's almost like
yeah,
a contradiction, right? The vulgar, the
yeah,
debased, and the so-called transcendental or whatever you may call it.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, it's fascinating. There's a Norwegian painter called Odd Nerdrum who um who paints these kind of classic paint, in the style of like the old masters. And he's got this one picture of it's a painting of Jesus actually called Ecce Homo, which
Oh,
is after Jesus has been arrested and beaten and stuff like that. And it's a picture of Christ in a prison cell with a crown of thorns on, but he's taking a shit.
okay, I've
And,
gotta
and,
I've gotta
and
find this and put it. I'll
yeah,
put it
yeah,
on the play of the painting.
and it's not a kitschy painting. It's a very well executed painting in a particular style that's attempting, I think, to make a really interesting point about the the humanity of a figure like Christ. That even in moments, if you're in a body, you're doing that along with everything else. You might have profound thoughts, but you're still gonna have to go to the bathroom.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the radical theologian and just overall guy that gives off great vibes, Barry Taylor. I've been meaning to talk to Barry ever since I came across his more public dialogues with Peter Rollins, who's been on the podcast multiple times and, as you may know, has had a almost Goliath influence on my thinking. And just it was quite nice to just chat to Barry about radical theology because in my head, whenever I think radical theology, I just equate it with pyrotheology, which is more of Peter's project. However, Barry comes off more as I'd say a vibes-based theologian, whereas Peter is really a philosopher and a theorist in his own way. But there certainly is a lot of similarities in their work, and they both certainly are fellow travelers. And just on the a topic of radical theology, it's interesting. I've had certain even listeners, but also people in my circle, including my own partner, question, why in the world am I interested in theology and religion? I mean, it's just, as far as they're concerned, they tend to be quite secular, never really grew up religious, and religion is just airy-fairy, random stories people believe in. You could call it opioid of the masses, whatever the case may be. The real reason is I don't think I know why I'm interested in religion. I am always drawn towards it. Any kind of philosophy, be it philosophy or any kind of art that has religious themes, I'm always drawn towards it. But if I could say one thing, it is the fact that religion never really goes away. The religious questions always remain. I mean, yes, we see this pathological resurgence of nationalistic Christian nationalism in the U.S., especially amongst the American evangelical, that sort of movement. So yeah, that sort of religion certainly is coming back in a very toxic form. I see that, but even leaving that kind of fundamentalist religion aside, just the questions that have been posited about to religion. So the questions of the absolute, or as Alain Badiou says, the questions of the one. These questions are in some sense the questions of our ultimate concerns, as Paul Tillich would say. These are the kind of questions that we can never really escape. And yes, we may not always use a traditional religious language to deal with them or answer these questions, but the questions nonetheless remain structurally or in its form a religious question. And so if I could give rational reasons as to why I think theology matters, apart from the fact that I'm drawn towards it, is because, well, ultimately the questions posited by philosophy are deeply, intimately interconnected to theological questions, which is why most great philosophers, not only in the West but even the East, are also deeply theological thinkers, be it Descartes or Leibniz. But then you may ask, why radical theology? Why not just stick to theology, kind of the classical theism, similar to how someone like, let's say, William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga would use classical theistic arguments for Christian apologetics, which involves giving reasons to be a believer, giving reasons to believe in God and for God and so on. The problem with that is ultimately, as the name suggests, it is simply an apologia. It is simply, in some sense, taking these quasi-axiomatic, predefined presuppositions about who God is or what religion is, and then building on an argument from there as to why you should become a Christian or whatever. The problem with that is ultimately there's nothing new there. There's nothing new, and also, more importantly, I think in contradistinction, what someone like Barry Taylor, a radical theologian, and Peter Rollins, what they would be doing is what I would call, in beautiful Hegelian fashion, an imminent critique of what religion is. And this is what you would call their project, which certainly Barry and Peter are involved in, this project of Christian atheism. However, before I do comment on that a bit more, a quick PSA. You may be aware that I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. I simply don't have anything to sell you, and I deeply do believe that we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive the tautology, we ultimately live in the world we live in, and I can't continue this project and sustain it if I don't have any kind of financial support. So as uncomfortable as this makes me feel, I sincerely would like to ask you to consider supporting this podcast financially. Needless to state, your listenership and viewership is more than enough support. However, if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you gonna get? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because I'm not selling you anything. You're not buying anything, but rather, if this podcast, if the work I've done has brought you any kind of value, if you've learned something new, do consider supporting me on these platforms, but to reiterate, only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. A few months ago, Peter, again as I mentioned, one of Barry's fellow travelers, he was on Cadell's podcast, Philosophy Portal, discussing the notion of Christian atheism for a course they did, and I was trying to encapsulate my thinking around this concept and I left a comment on that video. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read out that comment as to what I believe Christian atheism is, and as to why I think, more importantly, more than what I believe the concept is, why it matters to Christianity and any kind of religious thinking, regardless of your religious belief or lack thereof. And here's what I said in that comment. I said, finding atheism at the core of Christianity is indeed what makes the Christian Atheism Project radical. Could it be a Badiouian event? I refer to the philosopher Alain Badiou here, similar to the Protestant Reformation? We'll only know in retrospect. But I do know there's something traumatic to it too. For instance, I've been sharing a lot of Peter's, I should even say Barry's work with my Christian friends. I too am some kind of a Christian, and despite Peter being one of the most cordial individuals and his public talks are always affable, most of the people I've shared his work with are antagonistic towards paratheology and the like. The reason, in my view, is because Christian atheism is an immanent critique, much like what Hegel does with his presuppositionless metaphysics. And so finding this atheism within Christianity is diametrically opposed to an atheism imposed from the outer, which we see from the new atheists. This immanent atheism does more violence, in the good sense, to our subjectivity, leading to alienation, again, a good thing. In that vein, despite you or Peter or Barry not particularly using this language, I think Christian atheism is a deeply ethical project. But yes, this is sort of why I do think Christian atheism matters. And in fact, I would even argue, as I think Peter has made this point, that if Christianity is going anywhere outside of, let's say, kind of the fascist elements of it that we see currently in the rise in Europe and even in the US, it has to incorporate this notion of Christian atheism. Again, because with the whole notion of the crucifixion, we find this death of God at the core of the Christian message. On the note, I should mention this too. This podcast was supposed to be on Barry's memoir. However, unfortunately, the book only arrived a day before the recording date, despite having ordered the book a month before. That's what you get for living in Australia. But I'm hoping Barry is a very affable person, real good vibes. So this is the first of many conversations to come. And then maybe once I've gotten through the whole book, we could chat a bit more about his journey from going touring with ACDC to becoming a theologian. And not just any theologian, but as the blurb in the book says, a theist, non-theist, theist, post-theist. Whatever that means. That being said, a quick formal introduction to Barry Taylor, as I tend to do. Dr. Barry Taylor is a chair of the Department of Theology at Global Centre for Advanced Studies, GCAS, College Dublin. He's also the author of multiple books, including Entertainment Theology, Exploring Spirituality in a Digital Democracy, and Sex, God, and Rock and Roll, Catastrophes, Epiphanies, and Sacred Anarchies. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Barry Taylor on radical theology. Where were we regarding the body? Well, yes. I mean, firstly, I've been thinking a lot about how abstract thought works, and
Yeah.
it's. I don't know about you, but like at least for me, even when I think of abstract concepts, be it
Yeah.
in mathematics or computer science, I still think of it in when I conceptualize it, there's something physical to it. If I
Yeah.
take a abstract, let's say like a mathematical structure, I still
Yeah.
think of it as it pertains to like the physical world. And
Yeah.
that's why I find it kind of ridiculous when people sort of think of intelligence as being as this like almost mechanical reasoning machine without any
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
affect. Or as you mentioned, yeah, consciousness is it's a bit of a very vague term. It's hard to define
Yeah.
it, but certainly
Yeah.
affect, So
Yeah.
there's a
No,
lot.
I mean, it's really funny, people talk about, these days they talk about, the brain being hardwired and, software and hardware, and we use all the language of technology around that. It used to be, you know, they had the same language when they had video machines. Your brain is like a tape recorder or whatever, or a car. We always seem to apply whatever our latest technological horizon is. We tend to then say, oh, that's what the brain is like. The brain's like a car engine or a this or that or the other. And at the moment, we're at the point where, it's like a computer. It's all rationality. It's all logic, and so, sentience is simply, binary numbers or whatever, and I I'm with you. I think we too quickly dismiss what the body is in relation to thinking. We're thinking beings, we're speaking beings, but we're also walking beings and feeling beings and muscle bound skeletal beings.
Hmm.
And I remain convinced that our experience of thinking is it. How do you disconnect it from physicality? I just don't think you can. Or, well, you can, but it becomes this abstract thing. It's funny. I was talking to somebody earlier. It's to me, it's a disembodied concept. Like when somebody talks about, oh, the soul or something. Well, okay, but how do you locate the soul? It's a conception. You can't point to it, but you can.
Yeah, yeah.
And
But
and and maybe I'm too much of a physicalist in that regard, but
yeah,
I, I do think the body's way more important, and there's something about just wanting to circumvent flesh that just I think is the central. Maybe it's because it's the body ties you to death, and people are so desperate to circumvent it, whether it's through religion or through digitality.
yeah,
Like
I
live forever in a cloud.
yeah, yeah. I have a follow-up question on that. This is actually, you being a theologian, especially, but also I've been thinking about the notion that there's something about the body when we are confronted with the body.
Yeah,
It's almost we can't fathom. I joke around that, we humans, we have Galileo and Einstein, we listen to Chopin and beautiful
yeah,
art, but we also shit and piss and we're kind of our bodies are quite disgusting. So there's something where we can't fathom how both these things can. It's almost like
yeah,
a contradiction, right? The vulgar, the
yeah,
debased, and the so-called transcendental or whatever you may call it.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, it's fascinating. One of there's a Norwegian painter called Odd Nerdrum who um, who paints these kind of classic paint, in the style of like the old masters. And he's got this one picture of it's a painting of Jesus actually called Ecce Homo, which
Oh,
is after Jesus has been arrested and beaten and stuff like that. And it's a picture of Christ in a prison cell with a crown of thorns on, but he's taking a shit.
okay,
And
I've gotta find this and put it. I'll
yeah,
put an
yeah,
overlay of the painting.
and it's not a kitschy painting. It's a very well executed painting in a particular style that's attempting, I think, to make a really interesting point about the the humanity of a figure like Christ. That even in moments, if you're in a body, you're doing that along with everything else. You might have profound thoughts, but you're still gonna have to go to the bathroom.
Correct, correct. I mean, I would even say here, I don't know what my beliefs in God and whether I'm an atheist or a theist, but I still would say I'm a Christian. The reason I say that is because of this notion of of in some, it's, Hegel, I think, points it out beautifully, right? That notion of this like just unfathomable paradox where the absolute becomes like a
Mm,
dirty carpenter who gets crucified and like just like
yeah,
shamefully that paradox has to be, and I think Peter Rollins, from the people that I've read, he's the person who really, him and Zizek
yeah,
bring out this
yeah,
almost the vulgar and the divine where they connect.
yeah,
But what I want to ask is just the other question I had on your previous point was, Barry, regarding why do you think, I'm sure you've thought about this, especially in confessional Christianity, they speak of the flesh being sinful.
yeah,
And they talk about the spirit a lot, right? So the notion, like when I used to go to church, especially here in Australia, we have like a lot of these
yeah,
almost like Pentecostal, Planet
yeah,
Shakers, Hillsong,
yeah,
big charismatic churches. And
yeah.
there's this notion, it's really interesting where you they wouldn't, I mean, there's like a sense of shame to your body, but there's this notion that the body is kind of, it's lower than whatever the spirit or,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I
I'm
mean,
trying to find the words here, but why do you think maybe this is common to all religions, as you said, like ascetics, they try to,
well, I
path.
do think, yeah, sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
do think that there is a very deep thread within subjectivity in general, but within a lot of religion, that the pathway to whether it's enlightenment or salvation or whatever your particular religion's take on it is that part of the way you get there is by um sort of denying your earthly bodily desires. And there's a long tradition in Christianity of that ascetic practices. And of course, they're not quite as extreme as they were like in the Middle Ages when people were, trying to starve themselves so they could die at the same
Self-flagellate,
time,
yeah.
self-flagellate and stuff like that. But it still exists, the body in so many cases is seen as this location of trouble. It's, your body is what gets you into trouble. It's a strange split that I think in the end causes even more problems because you apply all of those prohibitions. And if you've read any Freud or Lacan, you know that
So
the
enjoying
minute
the prohibition.
the minute you imply the prohibitions, it's the thing that becomes your obsessive object of desire.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
you chase that. And I think there's a a strange body loathing that inhabits a lot. I mean, I can only speak really about with any kind of personal or authority about Christianity, because that's been the principal kind of religious experience. But looking around, you see in so many religions this whole process where the body becomes this vehicle. Um, and even the language, though, it's like there's that trendy sort of new agey thing. You're not a soul living in a body. You're a body with a soul living in it, and whatever it is, like this idea that there's some essential bit of us, that goes all the way back to the Greeks. The essence of the human is this thing, the soul or the spirit or whatever you want to call it, and this flesh is in the way. And
Obstacle.
yeah, it's an obstacle. It's an obstacle to, and you can read the Bible, you get in the New Testament, all flesh is as grass, so it gets burned up one day. There's this idea the body doesn't count for anything. But I think that's a real I mean I think that it's probably tied to a very, very deep unconscious fear of death and a longing, not, that it's almost that you just want to bypass the actuality of what being embodied means, which is you come from who knows where, you live and breathe, and then you don't live and breathe anymore, and
The finitude of life. Yeah, your
yeah,
mortality.
finitude is a problem, and somehow the body takes a lot of knocks along the way in the name of devotion, conversion, salvation, and that self-negation dynamic thing. It's a challenging. It's challenging because it does carry. It does generate a lot of guilt and shame in people because we start to generate and create this idea that the feelings that we have are unnatural. So if you feel a sexual urge, there's something wrong with that. When a sexual urge is part of what it means to be human. The question isn't that you feel it, the question is what you do with it. You know what I
Correct.
mean? But if it gets so narrowed down and so confined and put in a box that's so confining, it's like, they you say to people, oh, you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, and you should wait till you get married. And okay, but it's a very different thing uh I think we can all practice abstinence for periods of time. But if but not everybody's the same. And what's easy for one person isn't as easy for somebody else. Do you know what I mean? Somebody's libido is more alive. They're more interested in physicality. Someone else is more interested in something else, but this sort of generic rule gets applied where people have to live regardless of how that all that works. And then you wonder why people wind up in trouble.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then the
You know,
other thing
that was a
is,
vague answer.
yeah, but the other side of this is also where, see, I don't, no one's ever told me ever in my life to not have sex before marriage. In fact,
Yeah,
before I lost my virginity, the whole thing was, oh, if you haven't lost your virginity before you were like 17 or 18, I mean, what a
yeah,
loser. It's like, so I feel
yeah,
like
yeah,
the
sure.
shift in our
No, I
generation
meant if you, I
was.
meant if you grow up in church, if you
Correct,
grow up
correct,
in,
correct. Yeah, I mean, because I grew up in a secular home. I grew up in
yeah,
Sri Lanka, and
yeah,
everyone was atheistic. But what I'm trying to say though is like, isn't that interesting? The shift, how this is where I'd say, I'm an Hegelian through and through, where all positions ultimately lead to a contradiction. Where
yeah,
now, as I know you've discussed with Peter, but also Zizek points out, this notions now people the superego injunction is enjoy, going
yeah,
either spiritualist hedonism or just pure carnal hedonism, and
yeah,
that itself ends up making people impotent and just you
yeah,
can't. There's only, as we know, there is no limit to enjoyment, and so how these things,
yeah,
how and then the other side of that is then people, as you point out, go down the new age path where they start either fasting or
yeah,
they start running marathons or I don't know what I would
yeah,
take up CrossFit, and that becomes their new form of prohibition that they have to enjoy.
yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
it's
I mean, you can marvel actually at the the things we get up to avoid, to contain, to suppress, to sublimate, to repress,
yeah,
to regulate. I mean, it's not all bad. Like I said, a little abstinence here and there can be healthy for you, I mean, being mindful about things, not being careless with your life. But I do find it very troubling, um, the kind of body. I mean, I think it's body negation. I really at its heart, and it manifests a lot in many facets of Christianity. It becomes this moralizing thing where these broad spectrum rules are laid down that create, I think, very unhealthy environments. It's why people get into all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you this, Barry. Do you think, see, maybe I'm just a bit more cynical about our condition. Do you think even if we do, let's say, have self-acceptance or be like, okay, I have a body, I'm not, I'm an imperfect person, imperfect
Sure.
being, that we can still be at one with ourselves because of the unconscious? I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that I don't know if people ever really do find this place of equilibrium where they're like,
Oh no, I personally think, when people sort of say, "Oh, I'm trying to find balance in my life," I'm like, well, good luck with that. I think that's one of the sort of contemporary notions that I think is immensely problematic. This idea that you can achieve some kind of balance in your life. I think life is, at best quiet chaos, and and at worst other forms of that. So I'm not a big believer in the whole idea of finding a balance. I mean, I think you sort of just have to find your way as best you can with an awareness that all of these notions that we live with, that we're going to find balance, that we're going to realize our true self, or all those, they're just slogans that in the long run are probably not that helpful, or I don't find them that helpful. Let me just put it that way.
nah, I concur. I completely concur. In fact, I find, again, these things, it's only when you pursue this sort of balance or equilibrium or whatever it may be, it makes things much harder. Like I found I kind of buy into this notion where the best thing you can do is not focus too much on balance or whatever. Like focus yourself on maybe
Yeah.
on a project, on your be it your relationship, something as cliche as it sounds, something outside of yourself.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with you. And again, it's these things sort of slip into the cultural vernacular, and they become ways of thinking about the nature of the self,
Mm.
and become almost taken as given. It's like, oh well, of course you're looking to find balance. That's what we're supposed to do, as though that's always been something we're supposed to do. You know what I mean? Rather than going, well, where does that idea come from, and what does it even mean? It's when people go, I need to strike a work-life balance. I mean, on one level, I understand what they're saying. I don't want to be working all the time. I want to be able to have a life. Fine. But there are deeper questions, aren't there, about the nature of work and what quality of life is, and what are we doing? Are we just trying to reconcile our lives to a form of capitalism that demands this of us, and so we're trying to work that out? Or are we actually going, what do I think about work, and what do I think about life, and where do those meet, and what do I do with them? I think it just sometimes we get these sort of simplistic notions somehow handed to us that we feel obligated to enact. And I don't know that there's even any, I never really think about balance. I mean, I can honestly, I don't even know that that word sort of really occurs to me, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm some kind of neurotic. I can't even like for me, the worst thing in life would be balance. I like a bit of chaos and it's a
Yeah.
balance kind of it makes me feel a bit it gives me more anxiety, I think. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
understand.
I'm an obsessional neurotic. Barry, I'm a bit disappointed with myself because I ordered this book over a month ago. It arrived
Yeah.
last night at 7 p.m. and I was knackered. I had a long day, so I only got to read 10 pages. Uh, I mean, I'm
That's
like,
well,
I want to at least get
yeah.
through more than half the book. However, I didn't know it was a memoir. I thought it was a collection of essays. It's only when I was reading it I realized it's in fact a memoir. So. Uh,
Well, it's sort of it's a little bit of both, really. It it's episodes from so there are stories about my life, but they're not linear. And then there are essays about life around that, divided up into like I took that idea, you know, Freud's notion of the palliatives.
Yeah, positives. Yep, you mentioned that in the introduction. Yeah.
Yeah, so I sort of split it up, you know, art, sex, intoxicants, religion, and very loosely. And so some of them are personal, you know, some are personal stories, and then others are actually essays.
Yeah, well, one thing I do like is in the forward, Peter, he mentions that, well, we think to to gain a knowledge or a deep understanding of something, we need to kind of take the empirical approach in like in science. So that's one way of where you have like a huge data set and you analyze, measure, quantify, and then you
Yeah,
theorize. So that would be in the empirical natural sciences, or even more like in social psychology. But
yeah,
then he mentions then there's the other side put forward by someone like Kierkegaard or
yeah,
Freud, which is you go deeply into the subject, into the self, whatever that
yeah,
may be, if even such a thing exists, and then through
yeah,
that you come out of these real almost like punches. I don't know what term there is. And so he says that this book is one of those kinds of work where you
yeah,
really excavated. That's called the inner life. Use Kierkegaardian term. But because kind of embarrassingly, I couldn't read the whole book. The blurb says here, interestingly, Barry Taylor began adulthood on the road with the world-famous rock band AC/DC, and there he found religion. He then became a theologian, priest, teacher, and here's the interesting part, and a theist, non-theist, post-theist. So I don't know what that means.
who
Uh,
knows? Who knows
so
what?
yeah. So yeah, for the listener, Barry, if you could just give us a I said prelude as to what you try to cover in this book, but more importantly, how you became a theologian coming from sort of that world of rock and
Yeah,
punk.
I mean, well, I think I was always particularly religiously inclined and didn't grow up with religion in Britain. You know, I mean, I sort of came of age in an era when and you know, no very few people believe in God in Britain. You know, it's not exactly a robust uh, religious practicing nation. But I was always interested in philosophy and when I mean this is a very short version, but when I was touring and traveling around the world with a band, I think I just sort of reached a point where, for me, I realized that there were some things that I wanted. Well, two things. I think I I sort of reached a point where I thought that I needed some kind of meaning structure to help me handle. essentially, today I would say to help me handle my melancholy, because I felt sort of in many ways deep down constantly at war with myself and struggling with a deep melancholy. I recognize that now. I didn't know that then. I just thought I needed something in my life that gave it a kind of stronger structure. Don't know why really. Just I just felt that I wasn't making it by myself. And I think probably early on I thought maybe that, music, rock and roll and stuff would give me something that it didn't. But and my first step was to sort of go back to my interest in philosophy. And so out of sort of recovering and starting to read philosophy and stuff again, I realized that a lot of the philosophy that I'd read and was reading was actually engaging with religion in one way, so whether it was Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or whatever it was I was looking at, that it was engaging with religion negatively, positively, but that was part of the conversation. And I hadn't noticed that when I was younger. And I I thought, well, I don't know what I think about religion because I'd never really, other than sort of religious education at school, never really paid it any attention. I grew up in a sort of very left-wing world. I was very interested in, Marxism and socialism and stuff like that. So I'd sort of disregarded religion largely. So I thought, well, maybe I need to sort of work out what I think about that as well. And in the course of doing, and this is a very short version, but in the course of doing that, and I checked out quite a lot of religious traditions because I figured the least interesting would be Christianity because it's the religion of your culture. You know what I mean? But I realized that I found something interesting in the sort of figure of Christ that I found um, helpful, inspiring, and it had a lot to do with I think part of the immediate equation at the time was that I was less than impressed with what I was becoming as a human being. I
Unbuilt.
was just not loving myself that much.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Being on the road with a band is fantastic and it's a really wonderful experience, but it's also quite easy to take advantage of situations with people because you're in town, you leave town. You,
It's
you, you know what I
ephemeral
mean?
life. Yeah, yeah. I did a bit of
Yeah.
backpacking, and same thing. When you backpack, it's very
Yeah.
ephemeral
Yeah.
life, and
It's, you sort of run away to the circus, you throw a party for a group of people and then you leave. Nothing wrong with that. It's just there was something within me that was feeling that I wanted to be again, at the time I would have said a better person. I don't believe that that's really a goal in life, but then I think so. So I was like, but then the kicker was I met this girl. Well, I met this girl. I had sex with this girl who was in a cult.
yeah, I know you mentioned that in
Yeah,
the first few
in
pages.
in a Christian cult. And when we had sex, she asked me if she could pray for us. And I had
Never happened. Never
I
happened to me.
had no idea what that even meant. You know what I mean? It was just completely random and out of the blue, and I didn't have a reference for it. It didn't bother me. I was like, yeah, whatever. I mean, I don't know. We're already here, but sure. And she prayed this kind of basically what I understand now was a kind of real Jesus-y prayer. You know what I mean? And then the next day, I sort of woke up in a house which was a house of this cult. And, it was a room full of people having like a Bible study and singing songs and all this shit. And but what was interesting was it it was the first person that I met who seemed to have a genuine encounter with religion that was meaningful. And it sort of changed my perception because it changed my reference point for thinking about it. Um, because I hadn't come into contact with that kind of thing before. And that sort of added to my ongoing search or quest or whatever. And so initially I just said, oh, well, I'm just going to sort of try and what I got, it's very naive really, but I actually it's the naive thing that I've held on to. What I really got when I read the Gospels from the story of Christ was a kindness and generosity that seemed to emanate from his person towards people who were broken or being judged or critiqued or whatever. And I was like, that's actually that's what interests me. That's what now I could have got that from lots of places probably. You know what I mean? But it's where it sort of resonated for me. So initially, that's where I started. But then, long story short, I wound up living in California, and there I had a couple of English friends, and they'd become Christians, and I just sort of got involved in Christianity almost by default. And and initially, as I said, I thought having this sort of explanation of how everything fit together would somehow lift this weight off me that I could feel, almost tangibly feel. And I I sort of dug into that, and in the very beginning, it was very sort of classically, hipster, charismatic Christianity of the late 80s, that whole kind of thing, and but after a while, a few years to be quite honest, I realized that I was actually feeling a kind of internal anxiety because of religion, because I was feeling like I couldn't live up to what was being put in front of me all the time, and B, didn't really want to live up to it because I didn't really think it was that true. And I was like, well, what am I going to do about this? And I sort of thought, I think I need to think about this more deeply. I was torn between walking away or digging in deeper, and I decided to drill deeper. So
Yeah.
so I sort of looked around, and I wound up going to a theological school, and that's kind of where it started, really. And what's interesting is I went there with questions that really they didn't have answers for, but I realized that the academic environment was a place where I could ask those things for myself, and I sort of then began this essentially 20-year journey out of Christianity into I don't know what, but like because then I sort of picked up, deconstruction and postmodernism, and began and continental philosophy and then eventually found my way towards Altizer and the whole radical theology and the break with confessional Christianity, all the while working through confessional Christian environments of varying sizes and shapes and fashions, and and ultimately in the middle of all of that was really, and it's funny, because along there were many things along the way that were musical moments that shifted the ground of my thinking. And I've said to people since then, I think that the only church that I've been true to my entire life is the church of music. And I think that really my deepest theological understandings have come from the world of music, really, rather than even the world of theology, particularly because I tend to be a bit more of a an arty. I sort of look at the world through an artistic lens, really, whether it's visual arts or music arts and things like that. And so it's that I had a really strong theology of death, and it came from Jackson Brown, who has a song called "For a Dancer," and it's and I real this was the summation of my theology, and it remains the summary of my theology. I don't know what happens when people die. Can't think about it as hard as I try. It's like a song that I hear singing right in my ear. I can't sing, but I can't help listening.
Yeah, yeah. You also mentioned in one of your chats, I forget with whom, David Bowie, that you like that
Yeah.
whole
So
his
so
identity of non-identity. So you mentioned.
yeah. Yeah. So uh, and and so I just began to sort of work through and go, well, maybe you don't have to think about Christianity in this particular way. Maybe there are other ways of thinking about it. I mean, there are multiple ways that people think about Christianity anyway. Christianity is not, it may be monotheistic, but it's not monolithic. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of denominations with very nuanced differences. You've got Orthodox, you've got Catholic, you've got Protestants, but within all of those, you've got, layers and layers of perspectives. So I just sort of began to sort of work out, well, what do I, and the first thing that went was, I, well, two things really went. One was I realized that I am not an overarching structure person. And I realized that trying to find some meaning structure wasn't going to solve the thing that I thought I needed to do. That's when I started therapy. That's and later a bit of psychoanalysis, so you can really sort of come to terms with your melancholy,
Yeah.
and see it for what
Well,
it is.
I would say for sure we've just got the tagline: Christianity is monotheistic but not monolithic. So
There
it's
you go.
monolithic. That's gonna be the tagline. Yeah, perfect. That's the
Oh, is that
title.
right?
Barry, there's a lot I want to ask you here. Okay, let's.
Sure.
I know. You've got this notion of theology beyond religion, which I kind of want to discuss for sure. However, if you could hone in a bit more on religion, and the reason
Yeah.
is, I don't know, maybe I just want to ask you like these naive questions, which just,
Yeah.
these days we hear these questions being asked sort of sociologically or culturally. Are
Yeah.
we so in Australia? Well, Australia not really because people are, it's a secular country. Like I wouldn't say Australia is a Christian nation anymore, but we rarely
Sure.
find. But at least in the West, there is this question here. Are we a Western culture? Are we a Christian culture? So they ask these questions somewhat sociologically. But I'm
Yeah.
curious. I mean, after, through your catastrophes, epiphanies, and sacred anarchies, through your journey, like what is religion? Like, as in, if I could just naively posit that question to you, what is religion?
Well, I, yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways to sort of talk about that, but I mean, at its essence, I think religion is a means by which people generate some understanding about the world they find themselves in. And it comes with accompanying rituals and practice. I mean, it's everywhere in the world. There's probably not. I don't know that there's a culture that doesn't have some religious aspect as part of its function. In a sense, it seems that humans and religion go hand in hand, probably because the questions of ultimacy have always been there. Where do we come from? What happens when you die? What does it mean to live? You know what I mean? And that used to be the domain of the gods. You know what I mean? That the answer was, well, obviously there's God. This figure. I, I mean, to be more specific. I mean, I know there are many people. Europe is largely, you could say, post-Christian in the, religion is still present. I mean, it's present in Australia. It's around, but have the hold on the culture that it used to have. There are probably less and less people that subscribe to particularly traditional religious practices. You know what I mean? But the 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 structure of Western cultural life is heavily indebted to ideas that emerged
And
out of Christianity, and they're undeniable. I mean, the cultural theorist Mika Bal, the Dutch theorist, she sort of talks about the vapor trails of Christianity that are part of the building block of sort of Western culture and Western civilization, if you like. So, in a sense, when we talk about religion and secularity, I think that they're not false oppositions, but they're part of, I think they're more of a sort of continuum of experiences.
very
Uh,
Hegelian. Yeah.
yeah, it's okay. Yeah,
No,
I guess it
no,
is.
yeah.
I'm not as big a Hegelian as you or Pete, but because I'm not, I'm not the big overarching person. That's why. So I'm not looking for the absolute theory or the absolute knowledge or
System,
the
yeah.
absolute essence. Yeah, so, um, but,
It's a very
but
masculine urge. It's a very masculine urge, you could say. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Knowing,
Yeah, I
find the
guess,
totalizing theory.
I guess I lack testosterone in that realm.
Hey, even if you do, that's fine. Yeah. That's not what I was
But
implying, but
yeah, yeah, no, I'm kidding.
uh,
But so the question of religion to me is fascinating because everybody is quick to dismiss religion, but religion doesn't go away. It emerges and I think the religious impulse. I mean, Nietzsche, God is dead and you've killed him, but there'll be other gods. And, there are gods everywhere. We make gods out of all kinds of things. So, in terms of strict, like sort of sociological, anthropological definitions, religion is, a whole set of beliefs in a sacred being, with all the rituals and practice and stuff like that. But to me, there's something of the human longing and yearning that just lends itself to the impulses that used to find expression in religion and still do for lots of people in the world. I mean, we forget sometimes in our uh, Western ivory tower that for much of the world, belief in a god or some kind of sacredness is as accepted as everything else. And it's almost, the principal operation that people go by. I mean, and I think we're way too quick to dismiss that because it does tell you something about subjectivity, that this longing for some big other lurking out there that tells you how it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, without a doubt. I mean, Frederick Jameson, he famously writes that, capitalism functions like a religion.
yeah,
The big other
it.
would
I mean,
be the
yeah,
market or whatever. Uh,
yeah.
and
Science, but I mean, it's so funny, they pit science against religion all the time, but science functions religiously. I mean, I have no horse race in uh creationism or the Big Bang Theory. But I find both of them equally as troubling because on one level, it's conjecture, isn't it? You know, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get too in the weeds about that. I mean, but it doesn't even matter to me where we came from. I think it's a redundant question.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We're here. We're here. What are we going to
We're
do while we're
we're
here?
thrown
What,
into
what,
this.
what is it?
Yeah.
To me, I wasn't, I am, and I won't be. The only bit I have any involvement in, as far as I can see, is the bit in the middle, the living part, the living, breathing part. So that's what interests me. What happens when before I was born and after I die, I don't know. I don't have an answer to those things, and I don't actually feel the need for one, you know. I'm interested in what it means to live and whether we live.
Yeah, yeah. I listened to a talk. It was an old talk by Paul Tillich, one of his few ones that were
Mm.
recorded. And he has this notion in symbolism of eternal life. He
Yeah.
thinks that, when people speak of eternal life or the afterlife, what they're really thinking is an extension of this life. So really
Yeah.
their focus is on this life. It's not the
Yeah.
afterlife. So
No, it really isn't. Yeah. Well, that's why, when people talk about, heaven, they sort of describe it. It's like you're going to get your mansion because Jesus says you're going to get a mansion. So you think, well, what kind of mansion? Is it a 17th century? Is it an 18th century Georgian house, or is it a modernist, Frank Lloyd Wright place? What kind of mansion is it? And what kind of furniture will be in it? I mean, I like Simon Critchley, the philosopher. He says, I believe in the afterlife because I believe in life that comes after me.
well put. Well put. Yeah.
And that's for me, that's the only afterlife I can think of,
Yeah.
that there will be life after I'm gone. The world will go on living.
Yeah. All right. Now to provoke you a bit, Barry, I really wanted to ask, because I've heard you discuss this I think with Peter and a few others. This, again, pertaining to the question of religion. So,
Mm,
let me see if I could develop my idea here. So just
yeah.
bear with me for a moment. Yeah. So, okay, you take people, Jordan Peterson, big name.
Mhm.
He always accuses, in fact, probably people like you who are more like left wing, kind of in the
Mm,
academic circle of being postmodern neo-Marxists and all these notions, right?
yeah.
So, but I'm coming to realize if you look at the MO, the modus operandi of people like Peterson or more from the conservative side,
Mhm.
politically speaking, uh, they are the true postmodernists because if you look at what they're like, Jordan Peterson, you ask from him, do you believe in the resurrection? Do you believe in the body of the resurrection? And say, oh, I believe. I think I believe for the sake of believing, and that itself is good. So he'll
Yeah.
he'll read the Bible to find like pragmatic wisdom. He'll
Yeah.
read the Bible as like a true pragmatist, where he wants to find gems and
Yeah.
then and so it's the truth for him lies in its pragmatic effect.
Yeah.
For me, that's in some sense the postmodern reading of the Bible, because you're not looking for any kind of truth. What a it's not even what a classical theologian like an Aquinas or an Augustine
Mhm.
did, what you could say, but rather it's, well, we need to preserve these documents because it's foundational for our civilization, our culture.
Sure.
If and so what I'm trying to understand here is this notion of what you would call, it's a stupid term, some might say, authentic Christianity or authentic
Mhm.
religion. Do you think such a thing exists in your view? As in, is there anything? And if I could have a bit of a, let's say, a addendum to that, would be this notion, Zizek talks about belief, that there's no authentic belief. You believe because the other believes, and the other believes because the other believes. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to hear what your views on that are as a theologian.
Well, the second part is easier for me. I think when people talk about believing, like I think the least interesting question when it comes to the whole idea of God and religion is, do you believe? I I
Yeah.
think it's low hanging fruit. I actually think it's a meaningless question. However you answer it, whether you go, yes, I believe, or no, I don't believe, or I believe that I believe because the other believes. I mean, uh, so I'll just leave that there. With the the challenge, I mean, there's two things. One, there's this weird sort of backlash going on at the moment about postmodernism. You know, postmodernism seems to be getting the blame for all the ills of the world at the moment. Everybody seems to be having a go at postmodernism, going, "Oh, postmodernism messed up everything," and you have different responses to that. But Zizek critiques postmodernism. Jordan Peterson critiques postmodernism. My response to that is, well, but you're having these conversations because of postmodernism for a start. Had that not occurred, you wouldn't be having these conversations. So in a sense, the idea is in flow within the culture, and we have the conversations that we have because these ideas came into play. But the problem with somebody, that sort of says, authentic Christianity, it comes back to that whole thing. Well, whose version? See, Jordan Peterson says, well, we need to preserve Christianity because we need, the wisdom that it affords, but it's the wisdom that he draws from it that he believes is the wisdom that we need. And somebody else goes, well, no, that's not the wisdom that we need. We need this wisdom. You know what I mean? It's like it's that old dictum, where you stand determines what you see, and what you listen to determines what you hear. And maybe what you do determines what you believe. But I don't really believe in beliefs. But
Yeah.
so I think that authentic religion is probably one of those questions that's not really answerable because it's always going to be. I mean, if you mean authentic to me usually means, like the essence of something. Like I think, like one of the things that you see online, or that has emerged out of sort of digital culture is, this whole thing of, I just want to be my authentic self.
This is why I asked the question. Yeah, because
And
authenticity is very much in our culture.
I don't think such a thing exists because it's too essential. It implies that at the core, there's a static you that you're trying to get back to. And I think authentic religion is exactly the same. It's this idea that somewhere there's this perfect kernel of understanding that if we get back to it, it'll all be okay. I think that religion, well, I think that as subjects, we're always becoming. And I think religion is also always becoming because it's a dialogue between people and the experience of their subjectivity in the world. So, how we talk about religion today is very different to how we talked about religion 50 years ago. And if you ask somebody 50 years ago, perhaps, what authentic Christianity was, you'd get a very different answer from somebody who might answer that today. Do you know what I mean? It's
Totally.
uh, it's a bit like I remember there's this really interesting quote. I can never remember these days because it's so long ago. I think it was Derrida, but it might have been Lyotard. But it was it's Derrida. He in an essay on knowledge, he said that the growing disconnect between our ignorance of and reliance upon technology is opening up a space for the rise and the return of the magical, the mystical, and the animistic. And I think there's a deep truth to that. And the implication is that the very thing that we're communicating through, this phenomenon of the internet, which is yet another technology about, I mean, you're a computer engineer, so you're a lot clearer on it. But for most of us, how this stuff works, we don't really know, and we're dependent on all of these technologies that connect us to the world. And we're reliant upon these things, but we're really quite ignorant of how it all works. And Derrida's argument was that opens up a different kind of existential space. And to me, it's no surprise that in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a growing interest in things like mysticism and magic and mystery, because we've increasingly moved into spaces in life where we have more and more knowledge of things and less understanding, and the questions keep growing. So it's no surprise that we have, quantum thinking and we've moved from certainty to uncertainty and things like that, and we're aware that the the beyond the limits of our knowledge are horizons that we've not yet realized. So, what's authentic religion in a digital age? It's going to be characterized by how we experience our subjectivity through the way that we live in the world, I think. Is that a vague answer? I don't know.
Oh no, no, it does answer it because I was gonna say that I believe there is an authentic religion, and it's unknowing. It's what you and Peter are doing.
Sure.
It's coming to this point of unknowing. And look, it's fair. I don't want to put that in a complete like Pollyanna, everything's, I mean, that can make one deeply despondent that there is no big other, that
Yeah.
not even God knows the answer, that not even God has figured it out. But
Yeah.
I think ultimately when I think of it, in some sense, there's the structure of religion, to use like just like a
Yeah.
technical term, I guess. There's this unknowing built into it.
Yeah. Well, I read somewhere a couple of days ago that it's interesting that in both psychoanalysis and religion, which are basically two fields or two disciplines, at the heart of which is the unknowable, you know, within psychoanalysis, the unconscious, and within religion, the big other, God or whatever. But essentially, in both realms, there are disciplines that work with what's unknowable, that they can become very strident and dogmatic. I mean, to me, it's antithetical to be able to be particularly dogmatic about that. And I think this is where, I'm sort of indebted to Camus, really, because what I learned from Camus, that life is meaningless. But if you can accept the meaninglessness of life, you can find significance and joy in it.
Yes, a true
And for
existential.
me, yeah, and I might say, well, that could be the basis for an authentic religious understanding of life. I mean, for me, rather than and this is sort of where I journeyed away from this kind of idea of a meaning structure that explained the world to me. What I really had to come to terms with was two things. My own unknowability, that I'm unknown to myself, and that, shit comes up, and I don't know why it's come up, and maybe I will never know. Some things I will get clues about, you know what I mean? And I've learned some things about 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 myself and my life, but I remain unknowable to myself on a very sort of deep level. And coming to terms with that was a process of liberation for for me. And the other side of it was working through sort of theological ideas and coming not to knowledge of God, but unknowing, and encountering the impossible and the unknowable, and the the void, the emptiness, and yet in that finding creative energy in a very Deleuzian way. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, okay, this is a perfect segue because my next question was going to be, I've been reading Helen Rowland's her
Oh
book
yeah.
Psychocinema,
Nice.
and beautifully written book, succinct to the point. And one point she makes is that cinema, sort of like
Yeah.
what happens in the clinic with the psychoanalyst, it has the ability to make one confront their desires and then
Sure.
ultimately confront one's lack. And then,
Yeah.
because I was reading this last week and I knew I had this conversation, I was
Yeah.
thinking, well, in many ways, isn't that the project of at least yours and Peter's, let's say, variant of radical theology,
Mm.
where you are trying to this is a difficult thing, but all right, sorry, I'm just gonna go on a bit of a personal
No,
anecdote.
no, it's fine.
When I was a lot younger, when I was like
Yeah.
15, 16, I was a full-on Richard Dawkins type of atheist. And
Yeah.
now after having read a bit of psychoanalysis, I've realized that like my enjoyment was the way I enjoyed my atheism
Mhm.
was
Yeah.
by almost like with a sword or with a hammer, like
Yeah.
disproving religion, saying all these
Yeah.
like having these religious debates and trying to enjoy breaking down people's meaning
Yeah.
structures.
Yeah.
Rather,
Yeah.
rather cynical. I have no doubt that's
Yeah.
I'm kind
Sure.
of ashamed of that side. About I was 16. I was much younger. I was an idiot. Still am. But then I'm kind of realize so, but still, I don't want to go to the other side and then be like, oh, I'm gonna help people come to Jesus and like find meaning, almost like be like a messiah. That for me is too narcissistic.
Sure.
So, but I'm wondering through the project of radical theology, can we help? No, I don't know if help is the right word, but as a community, can we allow people to confront this unknowing, this lack, kind of what Helen speaks
Oh,
in psychocinema? in a way that it's not like this where you enjoy breaking down people's big other or meaning structures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because it's interesting because what you basically were when you were 16 w was an evangelist for your faith,
For my faith, yeah, correct.
and your faith was in faithlessness.
Yeah.
But you were practicing as an evangelist. Basically, the contradictory thing between theism and atheism, they're actually arguing about the same thing, but from different ends of the continuum, you know. And I think for me, um, I have absolutely I feel no need to challenge anybody's uh, way of looking at life. I don't agree with lots of ways that people look at life, but I'm not an evangelist in that sense. But if people are open and want, conversations about life and about stuff like that, then I'm more than happy to sort of talk about how I think we can come to terms with our subjectivity, and rather than trying to find this elusive fulfillment or self-realization or equilibrium or balance or all of the things that we're told will bring us lasting or perhaps everlasting peace. Um, if we can talk instead about finitude and contingency and unknowing, and come to terms with the limits of what what it means to be alive and to think, then I think it can be a really fruitful conversation, like any conversation. I mean, sometimes it's that people just don't have they've just never been exposed to the idea that maybe, because I mean, if you haven't read much psychoanalysis, you don't hear an awful lot about, lack. I mean, you don't, it's a very niche way of looking at life that comes out of, the Freudian and really Lacanian interpretation of Freud. So in certain circles, it's everything, but in other parts of life, people haven't even heard of that idea. You know what I mean? So there are lots of things that I think can be helpful to people, that they just haven't sort of really been exposed to. Like desire. Like everybody knows that I think pretty much everybody knows that consumerism promises you stuff that it can't deliver, but we don't know why we know that, because we don't really know much about desire, because we don't really talk about desire in the way that it's talked about in Freudian circles. You know what I mean? In general, we don't. So part of the I guess the work, if you want to call it that, that I've done, and that Pete does, and that we sometimes do together, is to really have conversations that give people opportunity to think about things in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason I asked you this question in particular. I've asked Peter this question too. I think in our first episode we did together, is that because you both are practitioners. Because I mean, there's a
Yeah,
difference between being a theorist and a practitioner. However, I would
yeah,
argue by being a practitioner, one sort of uh, becomes a theorist, de facto theorist, or not de facto, but
sure.
just you can't not be a theorist by practicing whatever.
No, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, but I'm very interested in I'm not particularly interested in abstract ideas. They need feet for me.
That's fair.
They need to sort of be helpful to somebody in their life. Just ideas floating around in your head, they're great, but if they're not impacting the way you look at life, I don't know. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, because I think I'm more the former, where I live in the abstract world. Like sometimes I
well,
feel
I think we're sort of conditioned that way, really. You
interesting.
know what I mean? Especially if you do any kind of academic study, regardless of the field. It's all theoretical.
It's very
It's
theoretical.
all theory. And I suppose that the difference between Pete and I think, and we work together a lot, so we complement each other greatly. But Pete is much more of an overarching theorist person, and he operates much in that, you know, Hegelian, Zizekian, Lacanian. That's his trinity,
Reality.
really.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that's his triad. And I get a lot. My um my graph would be way more, multidisciplinary. I read very widely, and I I don't, like I said, I'm not looking for an overarching explanation for the whole of reality. I don't believe it exists. So I find it really interesting, and I I don't know, I can just hold lots of things in tension, and I'm aware that I hold contradictory ideas, but I do think what we the commonality is around very much this kind of, after the death of God within the horizon of Christianity, particularly, what then? What does that look like? What do you do with those things? Again, Pete's got more of a project about that than I have. He's got this vision of creating, these communities of contradiction, and I don't really, I don't really have that. That's not. I'm happy to support him in that, and help in that in whatever way I can. I think more. I'm very much. I come much more from the intersections with what's going on in the world. So, in some ways, Pete is a pure philosopher. He reads, and he sort of looks at the world over the edge of the book, and the ideas. I tend to be more embedded within the culture. I'm like sort of thinking about fashion and technology, and I don't know, neuroscience, and a whole host of things all at once. And I've always been interested in the things that don't fit, the sort of clinomens, the bits that bounce off the ideas, where things intersect, and where they diverge from each other, and stuff like that. But all of that, in a sense, is really in the service of going, well, there are other ways of looking at life, and there are other ways of being in the world. And you can spend an awful lot of time, arguing with people, critiquing, as so often happens, or you can just get to work trying to make something else and talking about something else. I mean, I tend to look at most things as poetry, really.
Mm.
So that's really kind of I look at it, I read it as poetry, and I listen to it musically. Like, what's the groove? What's the rhythm here? What's the downbeat? You know,
You're a vibes driven person.
I,
Yeah, I
I'm
don't know.
I'm
I
a,
just
I'm a vibes driven person. So and I sort of draw from a lot of places, but fundamentally, at the core of it all is for me is that there is more of life that's unknown and probably unknowable, and to obsess with that is probably not helpful, but to come to terms with that is very important, and to live towards, with this sense of the contingency of life, the randomness of existence. And if you like, if you can come to terms with the meaninglessness of it all, which sounds so hopeless, and yet to me, I think is funda fundamentally at the core an incredibly helpful thing, because I think that's when things begin to take on a kind of significance.
it's interesting you said that because I think that latter point you made about that there are some things that are unknowable and we should
Yeah,
kind of come into terms with that. I think Pete would disagree because I remember in
yeah,
his book, How Not to Speak of God, he has
yeah,
this whole where he takes Wittgenstein's that which we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence. He says
yeah,
he subverts that and he says
yeah.
brilliantly. That which we cannot speak of is the only thing you should ever speak of.
Sure.
And I love that because I think if you think of like a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
these about nothing, you can talk about nothing forever.
Yeah. And I wouldn't sort of agree, but I also do think that I would say that, yeah, that's the very thing to talk about, but how you talk about it is very important.
Yeah, yeah. Barry, this is going to be the penultimate question because I want to be mindful of your time. But I kind
Mm,
of want to ask you this because you made a very interesting sort of passing comment in your discussion with Cadell on Philosophy Portal. Apropos Lacan, you said that lack is lacking. And I think the point we were trying to make there was this notion, again, what you kind of intimated on this people in Lacanians, Zizekans, they speak of desire and lack all the time. And then, it comes, you sort of, correct me if I'm wrong here, you're trying to be like, well, yes, it's true, we are lacking beings, ontologically lacking beings.
mm,
However, in that concept itself, there's something you can't reduce the subject just to the
yeah.
lack, because maybe that's a
Yeah.
Deleuzian, but can you kind of elaborate a bit more on that notion of what you meant there?
Yeah, if I can remember. No, I think what I was ultimately trying to say was you can't reduce all Lacanian theory down simply just to lack. He talks about other things.
True.
You know what I mean? He talks about other things. And while I think lack is central, it's a key thing for him, because that's where, he sort of shifts kind of on the whole Freudian drives and stuff like that. So lack is a central component. But if you only talk about lack, then you're doing a disservice, I think, to both Lacan and to the whole conversation about being about subjectivity. I just it's and again, it would depend how you talk about it. It's like I have no problem holding Lacan's lack and Deleuze's void in the same hands. And and I think, you know, sort of the Deleuzean idea that the void is this sort of place of creative foment. You know
Mm.
what I mean? I don't think that's actually very far from Lacan and lack. Do you know what I mean? So I think what I was trying to say when I was talking with Hidel was I don't want to be too reductionist with theory. I don't and this is where, where my approach to life, my vibey approach to life is probably lacking because I don't just dig into one or two people. You know what I mean? It's like I'm you're not going to get me to sit down and read through all of Hegel. It's just not going to happen. I don't like it.
Yeah,
I'm
I know. I
not.
mean, honestly, in that regard, I'm a lot like you too, because
Yeah,
I read widely. The only thinker that I've really, sat down and read is really Hegel. Apart from
yeah,
Hegel, everyone else,
yeah.
even Lacan. I much prefer reading on Lacan than Lacan because I find him really hard to read and
Yeah.
just
Well, I think most people do because he's largely in. Speaking of unknowable,
he really does obfuscate. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I
I mean,
mean,
people say that about
yeah,
Hegel too, but I find Hegel
yeah,
has like a style, which is anyway.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And of course, this is the other thing about life, isn't it? You can be put off somebody's key ideas simply because you don't vibe with their writing style.
that's so true. That is so true.
And that's very much, and again, that it's like music. You sort of have to learn, because when we're young, we go, "Oh, I hate jazz." You know what I mean? Or whatever it is, you're in some, so, you're in with the headbangers at school or whatever. So you only listen to metal or you only listen to Taylor Swift or whatever it is, you know what I mean? And all of the music is just shit, you know what I mean? And it's basically because you don't know how to listen to that music. And it doesn't resonate with you at that time. And then a little bit later in life, you realize, oh, actually, I don't hate jazz. I just don't like it in this sense. But then you have to go to that second level where you can appreciate something even if you don't subjectively like it. So like in music, you can determine if a song is a good song, whether you like that song or not, based on whether or not it fits the criteria of the genre that it's meant to be in and if it's structured in the right way. You know what I mean? So there are different levels of stuff. And I think it's interesting how you can get knocked off course because you don't like the way somebody writes, and then somebody else, they love the way this person writes. And it's everything to them. And because it's everything to them, every idea comes alive. It's not, like some books you just have to fight with to get anything from. And then somebody else
That's
goes,
it.
I love that book.
Yeah, yeah,
I love that book. And you go, if I ever have to read that book again, I'll kill myself.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how we got off on that tangent, but yeah. So when I said that lack is lacking, what I meant was you can't reduce Lacan just to lack.
One concept. Yeah.
You have to come to terms with lack. But he had a whole, it's like when, recently we were together and Pete was doing a thing and he was doing the four discourses.
Hmm.
Great. And really, really, he does them really well and has got a really great take on them. But, Lacan had a couple of other discourses. The discourse of capitalism and the discourse of the unconscious. You,
Yeah.
you, you know what I mean? So I'm not, and that's not a critique of Peter. That's just to say there are these other ideas that are lurking out there. They don't have the same traction,
Same
but
salient. Yeah.
they're part of a and on, and they came later in the game for Lacan. And I think the unconscious one is sort of largely unrealized. It was something that he was working towards the end. But I, so I think there's always this, and so to me, the interesting thing is Lacan sort of reworked Freud for his world. And I always think that it's very important to, when it comes to ideas about life, to think about how they fit into the jigsaw puzzle of the life that we live now. And sometimes with theory, we just sort of drag it in. And this happens a lot with religion. It's sort of you have these conceptual ideas of how the world works, or how the person is supposed to be. And it's like a grid that you pull over somebody's life. And all the bits that don't fit, well, that's their problem. You know what I mean? They're supposed to make their life fit into this horizon rather than going, well, maybe there are some things in this grid that no longer apply. It's like if you read somebody like St. Paul, and the letters of St. Paul, integral to the sort of foundation of Christianity as we sort of understand it. Um, but they were written 2,000 years ago. He didn't go through the Renaissance. He didn't go through the Enlightenment. He didn't go through the the understanding of the ego or the unconscious or neuroscience or neurotheology or plasticity or any of those things. And and that's not to say there isn't wisdom there, but there's a lot of stuff that's come along the way that can enhance and actually alter the ground on which that stuff happens. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally, totally. I mean,
And, that, and
what
that's
I'm getting at,
that's a very important thing for me.
I
The
with that, I deeply resonate with Barry. I mean, I'd say here, in Kant's famous essay, "What is Enlightenment?" He talks about
mm,
dare to know. I'm coming
yeah,
to a place where I'm like dare to unknow, as in dare to face this unknowing and kind of tarry with it and work through it. But
yeah,
also, this is Khalil and I discussed this just a few weeks ago. In fact, this notion of one shouldn't get cynical or pessimistic,
no,
despondent about this unknowing. I find the unknowing to be the most fun thing ever. Like for
but
instance,
yeah.
I don't even know if I want to know everything. I mean, then life would be quite boring and
Well, it's well, look at the trouble we're in from the internet.
yeah, yeah.
Who knew that gathering together all of the world's information would turn us all into idiots?
And idiots. I mean, yeah, like lunacy. Yeah.
I know that's a very sort of trite comment to make, but I know I agree with you. A, it's impossible to know everything, and B, it's that whole thing, of this idea, which is very theological. The whole kind of singularity thing always reminds me of the Garden of Eden, where you can have, if you get all of the knowledge and you know everything, you'll be like gods. You know what I mean? And that's very much, one day we'll know everything, and we'll just be like the gods. And it's such a really a delusional notion, I think. Um, so yeah, I'm with you. I think there's something exciting about the not knowing. It means that there's discovery.
Yeah.
It's a bit like, that I mean, if you think about it, there's something very interesting it's the fact that you never uh, find fulfillment that keeps you yearning and looking. And I think, I mean, what I will say is I think an awareness of lack and limitation is the mechanism for a creative existence. That it's out of that because we have if you like a sense of lack, that the incomplete, the unfulfilled, and the desire that's never fully satiated. This is what keeps us moving forward, I think.
Correct, yeah. And also like very I'm sorry, I'm going a bit over time, just 5 more minutes.
Sure.
I think one thing I also am coming to realize is it's almost like an old-fashioned virtue, just courage. Have the
Mm.
courage, like Paul Tillich says, courage to be. I mean, because this notion of, as you said, the creative drive. Yeah, look, sometimes that the our lack and the openness of the world, it's dizzying, it's anxiety evoking. It's not an easy thing. I mean, life can get really hard sometimes when you don't know what the answers are. When you look at all the instability of life and just the caprice that can it's not always a walk in the park. However, that's where I think again it's a very like old-fashioned virtue. But I truly believe in this the courage. One has to have that.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, it's funny. I read today this quote from Adam Phillips, where he said, everybody is dealing with how much of their own aliveness they can bear, and how much they need to anesthetize themselves. I mean, it takes courage to live.
Yeah.
It takes courage to live, and we should bear that in mind when we deal with one another. We're all struggling with our aliveness, and
Oh,
what we're gonna what we're gonna do with that. And it takes courage. I mean, it takes courage to come to terms with unknowing, with the impossible, with meaninglessness and stuff like that. Sometimes it's to apply meaning for the sake of meaning on things. I understand that the immediate sense of comfort it can give somebody. Do you know what I mean? Takes the edge off the day. It's like a glass of wine or
yeah.
or or,
And you
or
need that
something.
too. You need that too, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, you do. I mean that's why Freud sort of said, we need these palliatives to
You
help
point
us
out in
with
the
the
book. Yeah.
vicissitudes of life. There's nothing wrong with them fundamentally. You just can't escape into them. I mean, his big critique of religion is that it's wish fulfillment, and instead of being a respite from life, where you catch your breath, it becomes an alternative to life. And you wind up living a sort of parallel existence to life in the real world. And for Freud, that's like just not good enough. But the idea that we all need a break from from reality, because it can be a bitch.
It can be a bit. Yeah, I mean, for me, in many ways, philosophy, especially the abstract kind, sometimes is that break from reality. And yeah, courage. All of these aren't mere anachronisms. They matter. Barry, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I
Uh,
wish I read more of your books so that I had more question specific pertaining to
well,
your
we
book.
can
However,
talk again.
that's what I'm hoping. Yeah, I want to get through this book, and then we can talk again. Especially given now I know it's a memoir. I like reading memoirs. But thanks, Barry. This has been great.
So welcome. Thank you so much.